Howdy folks, just wanted to put together a real quick little video on effectively how you, or at least I conceptually look at injuries in sport and how we can try to program to minimize the risk or at least try to think things through to really help our athletes perform well. So anytime you're working with anybody and we want to keep them healthy, the first and foremost goal of any training of any athlete is to make sure that they're available, that they can be on the field playing the sport, and then if you don't play a sport, that you can still be in this full contact, sometimes combat sport known as life. So we want to know what are the typical injuries. Well, it turns out a lot of people have back problems, a lot of people have knee problems. So that's something we're going to work with. We're working with just about anybody. But if you're working with athletes, you can have injuries named after the sport itself or famous athletes in the sport, like Tommy John surgery on pitchers in baseball, tennis elbow. We want to make sure that we're programming in a way that we're not going to make things worse. So we look, where is the sport asymmetrical? Where do they seem to have more injuries? What's going on with a typical athlete in the sport? So you can just do a literature search. You could heck even do a simple Google search of typical injuries in X sport. And then we want to make sure we program to avoid it. Now, the other thing is to look at the previous injury history of the athlete. Now, the reason you get hurt is a number of things. Physics. Sometimes you just get a large land mammal falls on you and your knee explodes. That just sucks. Sometimes it's faulty movement patterns, and sometimes it's even correct movement patterns just done to too great of a degree that the body could tolerate. Now, if you've injured an area of the body, there's a chance that they're probably going to have an increased risk of injury in that area or areas that might compensate for it for effectively the rest of their life. So we want to make sure that those individuals have programming that's not going to make things worse. And then finally, think about how their body type would tend to work in their given sport. And this is something that I made fault with this for many, many years because it turns out I am barely 5'10" on a good day, probably a little over 5'10" since my hair is super spiky during the pandemic and I haven't gotten a haircut. But my wingspan, I kid you not, from fingertip to fingertip is about 6'4", 6'5". So when it comes time to deadlifting for me is effectively lifting with a partial range of motion because of my leverages. However, at the same time, I have very long legs and a short torso. So when it comes to squatting, I've really got to get bent over, and it puts me in a much more potentially risky position with my low back. So when it comes to my own programming, I have to adjust it because if I just gave everybody I worked with the same program I use for deadlifting, I'd probably hurt them because their bodies are not made to do that much volume. And specifically, if you got something that has like T-Rex arms and a real long torso, man, they're gonna have to get really bent over to get that bar off the ground. So when you're looking at the program, you're looking at the athlete in their sport with their previous history and then how their body may or may not be put together in such a way to increase or decrease risk of injury from it. And then that is going to help us figure out what we need to do with our baseline programming in order to make sure that we are at least trying to do something to decrease our risk of injury. You're never going to nullify it. There's always a chance you're going to get hurt. I know of a number of power lifters that had nearly career-ending injuries slipping in a bathtub. So you want to make sure that we are doing our best to decrease that risk. And that is the way that I like to think about it initially. And then from there, obviously when you're working with teams, you're going to be writing programs for the average, but then you still want to make those changes to the individual. So you're going to be able to optimize each of them. Thanks for listening, guys. Have a great day.